that's how it's gonna be.
Yeah, I think we're good. I think that might be everybody actually. I don't see any. Those angels.
Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that, but I don't know, it's kind of nice. Comfy chairs.
What of this do I not need? I can get rid of this. Okay. Take two. All right, guys, so I want to start out classes just going over any questions you guys had on the homework. We just open to the group. If you wanted to ask any questions, it's like 5 minutes for anyone to just get anything out. We can just discuss at the beginning. Especially anything like if anyone had any issues like setting up the React project or like how they did things in the homework that are different from how we did it in class or anything like that. Any brave souls want to ask it in the open?
Both of you on Slack, so I'm good.
Okay.
I watched the video and picked out my boilerplate, got my boilerplate made. I don't even know if it's Code Academy. So I built that, and then I took the code that we have worked on, integrated it together, and it seemed pretty smooth. And so I had a big old party.
My question is, when you're putting scripts and stuff, like, how do you know what type of things to be import, or is it just something you can get used to, like, as far as like this scripts with source unpackage.com for React, and then React-DOM and Babel.
I think the React and the React DOM are pretty much always required, isn't that right? Like you need those so that it can interpret what you're doing.
To use React, yeah.
Yeah, and then Babel is basically would help compile it so that it's readable by like compile JSX, is that correct? Yeah, I'll let him explain, that's kind of what I understand.
Are you wondering like, how do you know what's coming out of it?
Like, do you, I mean, do you normally have like preset files of code that already have all this stuff, or do you kind of just like know like what you need as you kind of go?
So if you're working in a like this day one folder that I create, like my React app, this came with a package JSON, right? And so this, like you wouldn't normally use unpackage in most scenarios. That's just like a quick helpful thing. And so like here, like this says I'm using React DOM, and then it has like the version. So I'm using like React version. Is this too small? It's like here I'm using like React version 18.2, and I'm using React DOM 18.2, and like all of these other libraries. And so there's like there's like a tilde that means one thing, and a caret that means one thing, and you can use neither and just have exactly that version, or like one of them means like you can use, if it's a minor version ahead, it'll use that version. So like if we're on 18.2.0 and they push 18.2.1, then we would automatically get that update whenever we run npm install again, right? But this is determining what version of React we're using locally. Unpackage, you also are specifying what version. But like this is the standard of like specifying every package we're using and what version of the package. Because like if you change a version, like old React and stuff won't have a lot of the features that we're using. So if you're on like React 15 or something, then you know maybe all the things we're writing won't work because you're specifying I only want to use React 15. And so like this is what manages that and keeps tracks of that. So if you want to do like, let's say React 19 comes out and we're specifying React 18 or whatever, and you wanted some new feature that came out, you need to update this to the latest version and then install it. And then if that like broke your code, you need to go fix it. It's like if they have breaking changes or whatever. Normally packages try not to push breaking changes because then everyone who is using it would then destroy their code, right? But this is like if someone does push breaking changes, then you basically have to opt into them, right? So like your stuff won't go down because you're using this version and this version's stable.
So, but if you use Node to load up your React, you don't have to put a bunch of script files in there like the video script, right?
Right. Yeah. So This is all working because Create React app like built the entire environment and like, so it has this React scripts library. And so that library like has a bunch of stuff happening under the hood that is handling all of that stuff for you. Like whenever you run npm start, it just does a ton of stuff. And so like unpackage is like the guy who on Egghead who's in your homework, he's basically just wanting to do like the easiest way possible to just show the concepts and not like build out the whole environment. And so he just uses unpackage for like a simple thing, but it effectively ends up the same. We just don't need to do that when we're doing it like this. I actually didn't even know that was a thing until like I started watching his videos. Like this is kind of the standard. That's like just for learning and for testing and stuff like that. Sweet, anything else? All right, so we're gonna start with just a 10-minute warm-up. I want you all on your own, wherever you're going to work today, just create a new app, make a new component, just call it counter, and then I want you to import that component and use it in app.js. Okay, I'm just gonna put a timer for 10 minutes. This is better or for the honor? Is it Larry?
I like it all, that's me.
So now there's no, now that's not. All right, so that. Yeah, be careful with this command, because this is like reversing something, so. I would go there. So you know what the best. Thank you. So I think this is really fresh. Thank you.
You could call it day 2 or something, it doesn't matter. can go grab a chair or something, or you good?
You good? You wanna run it here?
Yeah.
So we're back in there.
Cool. Hey, is that here?
Hmm?
Is that here? The event?
That's downstairs.
Okay. What time should I try to wrap up?
Fine.
Just like at noon or like?
And then we'll run downstairs.
Okay. No, we're gonna replace it, just, you can just say a div account or something inside of it. Something to show that it's getting rendered.
Why doesn't it open, look like the console or command line if it's, what do you call it? Oh, yeah, just do your, whatever one you're working in, I guess.
and CD into whatever you name this app.
Like,
Yeah.
Doing good. Warming up.
So you will send me the name of the folder that is your use, which it looks like it's called dev. Or we already got it, you know, in there. You should be able to type in Indian or
Oh,
All right, guys. It is 10 minutos. Okay, I'm just gonna do exactly what you guys would do. So I'm gonna go to my terminal. I'm gonna CD into, for me, where it's located is in module 4. I'm going into day 4 or 2. That's the day we're on. Okay, and then I'm gonna, what command am I gonna run to create an app? Right, and then I just need to give it a name, right? I called the other one day 1, so I guess I'll just keep following that. So it's gonna do its installations and stuff of everything it needs. Sweet, okay. So now, oops, if I run a list, then I see a day 2 folder has been created. It's pretty small, huh? So I can change directory into day 2. And then I'm gonna, now that I'm in day 2 here, I'm gonna run the code period command to open it in VS Code. Okay, so I'm gonna open the source folder. I'm going to app.js. I'm gonna kill this so I can see. All right, so I've got just the default component that comes here. I'm just gonna go ahead and just delete it, all this header stuff. We don't need any of that. And then I'm gonna render, we'll write the component and then we'll import it first. Okay, so let's make a new file. Let's call this counter.jsx. We're gonna say const counter equals function. And then we're gonna return for now just a div. It'll just say counter. We need to make sure that we export this function. Export the component, okay? And then we're gonna come in here and I'm going to render the counter. Hit enter and it'll just import it for me automatically. Don't need this anymore. And then to close it off, you can choose the slash and then close. Okay, so now I'm rendering this counter. If I want to see it in the browser, then I need to come here. You'll see that I'm on the day 2 at the root level, not inside of source, not any lower. It has to be all the way at the top, right? And you say npm run start. Start building it, and then you can see really small there. We have this tiny little counter. Okay, everyone get that far? Any questions on that? Sweet, get that out of here. Okay, so what we're going to be learning about today is the stuff that was in your homework. We're going to be learning about hooks. And so these are like the most important part of writing React and like making it interactive, right? And so the first one is something, they all come from React itself, like that library is what gives you access to these. And so the first one is called use state. And so it looks like this. So I'm importing use state from React. You'll notice this has these curlies around it. And so the important part here is that this is effectively, you can think about it like destructuring, right? And so instead of saying like that, you could say React right here, and you could say React.useState like that. And so you can see it both ways. And so this React, that whole React object that's coming from React is just every method and everything that exists on React in one big object. And so I can say React dot use state, I'm accessing this method that exists on that object. So if I want to, by default, just get that method, because I know it's an object, I can get the use state right here. And so anytime you see curlies like this, that just means that we're like importing a named import, and it has to be that exact name. Okay, so you can't say like, I can't just call this like I'm gonna use state or something, right? Like it has to be literally use state. But if I was going to do a import like this, and I could just call this something, like this exists as React. I've just named it something. Whatever came out of React got shoved into this something object, right? So anything that gets exported, what goes here is the default export. And so if we go to like our counter, like we're saying default export, right? So if I were to import counter, like I do over here, it's just this, but I could even call this something else. Like I just call this my counter instead and put this here. And still, just because it's the default that comes out of there, that is what gets returned from this import. And so like this still works. If I wanted to do something like this use state, take that back. Oh, and you can see you can do both, right? I can get the default export and all of any named exports I want by using a comma and then destructuring the rest. And so let's say I wanted to, like, instead of default exporting this counter, you could just export the counter as a named object or as a named entity. I think this works, but you never see it like this. You could just say it like this. Export counter. And so whenever you come over here, now there's no default export. So this is nothing, right? This would just be undefined. And so if I wanted to access it, I would have to then say counter, and you see like it knows what I'm talking about because now it's a named export. So that's just something to be familiar with, is that there's default exports and named exports, and you can only import them the way that they're exported, right? Generally, if you're using a library or something, you have it installed already, it'll know what you're talking about, and so it'll kind of help you import them. When you're writing components, my practice is to just prefer to use a default whenever you can. And so we're just going to keep using defaults. Okay, so now I've got this thing, right? Let's talk about, like, does anyone know like what state is? Like, what does that mean?
Active or inactive, where it's being held.
Right. Yeah. So like state is like, it's kind of like a storage. Think about like a variable, but like a really fancy variable. And so all of the hooks have the word use in front of them, and any hooks that you write, like you can write your own hooks, anything you write that is a hook will need to start with use, just as a semantic thing. And so if I have this state, this storage, and I want to use storage, then I call use storage, right? And so what this function returns, if I like hover this here, is not helpful. So I'll just kind of show you the general structure. So it returns an array, and this is an array that is effectively a tuple, like it's an array with always two items. The first item is going to be like declaring a constant, and so I could say counter, and then the second item will be a method that useState gives you access to that will be used to update that state value, right? So the standard is to use set and then whatever your name is here. So I've got basically, this is like saying let counter equal nothing right now. And so like I've defined a variable one way and it's a counter, and I've defined a variable the other way using state, right? But if I wanted to say like set counter to 0 here, then that would not do anything to my JSX. You wouldn't see any updates basically. the important thing about the use state is that it does something called re-render this component anytime that that value changes. It's like hooked on to that value. And so for any time this value changes, my component will re-render and like execute all of this code again, return the JSX again in its new state if it changed. Where counter, if you're using a let and just trying to like set that value and overwrite it over and over again, it's not going to update your component ever. So here, so I've got this counter and set counter, right? So if I just wanted to say, return this counter right here, return the value that is in this variable, then whatever that value is will get rendered inside of my app.js, right? So let's go over here. We're just still rendering counter, that's it. Let me look in the browser. And we get nothing. Let's just say console.log counter. What are you doing? Okay. Come over here, open up our console, get rid of that. This is so small. So we're just getting undefined, right? And why is that? Like, what is counter equal to right now? Nothing, right? And that's because this use state takes a parameter, and that parameter is its default value. Just when the component renders, whatever that value is equal to that time, it will set counter to that, right? So if I just set it to 0, then now counter is based. This is like saying like const counter equals 0 if you were just writing like vanilla JavaScript, right? But obviously a constant couldn't change, and so like this kind of like saying let, but so now counter is equal to 0, and so now you can see in this tiny little screen, make it 700% to 0, right? Okay, so I want to create a button that will just increase the counter every time I press it. And so I've got this div. I'm going to wrap this in thingy, and then I'm going to do a button, and I'm going to just say increase counter. Save it, and I've got a bunch of red squigglies. Does anyone know what this error is trying to tell me?
It's not recognized.
So the arrow says JSX expressions must have one parent element. Yeah, so that's exactly right. So we have two components or two elements that are trying to be rendered, and it only wants one. So it's saying it needs one parent element. And so you could wrap this in a div. We talked about fragments, right? So you can create a fragment. Oops. Help me out here. There we go. I'll do this, I'll do this, and I'll do this. Oh, that's fine. Okay, so I don't know if we talked about the other version of this. So this is like sugar, this syntactical sugar that we have just the little element brackets. All this is doing is compiling it down to react.fragment. And so like to use this React namespace, I would need to import that here. Like this, and so like you'll see people do stuff like this sometimes. You could even just get it from here, like that. Or you can just use the shorthand, and your compiler will compile it down to something that it knows how to use. But it's important, like that is just like saying react.fragment. And a React fragment is kind of a weird thing. It's not an element on the page. It's just for React, right? It's like if I save this, and so like the tree right now is I've got, I just kill that. The tree right now is that I've got one div, and then I've got this counter, and the counter is wrapped in a fragment, it has a div and a button, right? So if I go in here and I look at the HTML, I see I've got a div, I've got the app div, and then I've got the 0 and the button, right? So there's nothing in between this app div and this. So like the fragment is just like just there for React, but it doesn't actually translate to any kind of HTML. And so whenever you're like, let's say you have a list, like an unordered list out here, and then you have a component that returns like, like a bunch of list items, you can wrap it in a fragment, and those list items will be directly inside of the list itself, not inside of any kind of wrapper. So there's no layer between them, right? Just a little thing, but it doesn't actually translate to anything in HTML. Okay, so I've got a button now. If I wanted to call this function every time this button is clicked, what would I need to add? Like what is the like regular attribute on a button?
On click.
On click, right? Okay, so if I'm gonna say on click, and then so if this was HTML, I would say like this, and then I would call whatever function like this, right? But in JavaScript, that is just a string, right? So then I need to escape it with my things. And so now you see it's yellow, so it kind of knows that it's a function. It's kind of getting, can you still see that? Okay. So now this is saying whenever, oh, I'm sorry. We don't know that. So whenever this is called, I'm going to call this function, that'll call this function, right? This is kind of the standard. Like if I wanted to pass something into this, like give it this some sort of arguments, then you could do it like that. If it has no arguments, which technically onClick gives you an event here, like a button clicked event from the DOM. And so you could like pass that event into here. And then, but setCounter doesn't take an event, it doesn't know what to do with that. So what does setCounter take? So there's a hint for you. It takes a value, and the type of it is a React set state action, and it says that it wants a number because it knows that this value is a number. Like if I hover that, because I initialized it with a 0, it wants it to remain a number basically, which doesn't have to. Like I could set it to a string, but this still doesn't know, and so it's kind of bad. And so we haven't learned or talked about TypeScript at all, but that's kind of the idea of TypeScript, is that if I initialize this counter as a number, I will only ever be able to set it to a number. And so for now, when you're just writing vanilla, it's kind of on you to make sure that you're not mixing types around, right? If this counter is a number, you want to make sure it's always a number. Okay, so you can set it to this. And so this setCounter method, it doesn't just take a number, it takes a React set state action. And so that's like a special thing, right? So you could just give it a new number, like you could just say like counter, access that variable from above, and you like add 1 to it, right? Crap. And so this would work, right? If I save this, come over here, increase the counter, you see that like every time I click it, the number changes, and the number is changing because the state of the counter has changed and it re-renders the component. So I call set state with counter +1, which then becomes like now 7. And then React sees that this state has changed in this component and is now 7. And then it re-renders the component. And then that's whenever you see the update here, right? So it's like, because I'm using this is what makes it re-render. And so I can click it and it works, right? But I'm accessing counter here. There's another option to pass setCounter. So like counter is a number plus a number that evaluates and then passes in whatever that result is, right? You can pass setCounter an entire function instead. And so you can get the previous value is kind of what it's called. And so I'll give it an arrow function. And so it's being unused, so I can use it here. And so instead of accessing counter itself, I'm just going to ask just whatever the previous value was, and then do something with that previous value instead. The important thing is that anything this function returns is what it will be set to. So the return value of this function, like I could do stuff in here and then return this, and it's still just a regular function, right? Oops. It's like I could do this, and inside of this here, I could like console.log previous value, right? And so like now whenever this function gets ran, I can see the previous value, do something with it, and then I can like update it all in one go. But like you're seeing, like this is getting a lot here inside of the JSX, and so it's pretty common to just take this whole function that we wrote and just move it into its own function. And so we can do that. So we can say like const handle click, which we can even make it more specific, like increase counter. Thank you, Copilot. And then now it's just going to try to follow everything that I wrote underneath. Okay. And so now I've got this increase counter function that I can call and pass in here. And so if you have this and you aren't passing any arguments, like this increase counter function takes no parameters, takes no arguments. I don't know which one's which, I just use them interchangeably. One is parameters. I think it's parameters on the function and arguments when you pass them in. Anyway, so it takes none, right? And so I'm going to call it with none. And so the shorthand for this, oops, is just like this. And so this is the same thing as saying, give me this function and call it with these parentheses. This is just like the shorthand. So we'll see that a lot. Okay, so now I can come back in here and I can start, this still works like I thought. And then I'm also logging the previous value every time. I'm actually logging it up here too. So if I do that and refresh, and then getting twice because the re-renders and stuff. Awesome. That's not really, you don't really need to do this. It's just kind of more code. And so for now, we can just say counter +1. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about state, use state, setting state, anything like that? Sweet. Okay, let me look at the thing that I'm supposed to look at, or I'm gonna run off the rails. Oh, I skipped these. We'll go back to this. I watched my recording last time because sometimes I like to see if I am making any sense or not. And I said that I was going to talk about destructuring props, and then I do what I do and I went off onto something else. And so we can talk about this. And so if we look at like last homework real quick, not public source, and inside of my like navbar item. Yeah, so like I took in this props object, but I never like actually destructured it. And so what that looks like is this has to be wrapped in parentheses. If you're just having one item passed in, it'll like try to remove the parentheses for you, or you don't need them necessarily, but you could still have them here. Just my linter removes them. And so then if you want parentheses and I want to access an item or an attribute or a property is the real word, a property on this props object, then I can do it like I was doing the import and just get just that thing. So last time it was title. And so I can get the title off, and then props no longer exists. And so like you can do it like that. And so this is kind of like, I think the cleanest way. If I have like 17 props, I don't want to say props dot props dot props dot. You could just say like title, name, number, phone number, like you can just list them all here and you'll have access to all of them off of that object. Okay, so we'll just leave that there. And we'll start doing that in our stuff today. So that's general destructuring. The properties that come through are always going to be an object. And so you can always destructure from the props. Okay, so let's go back to, I skipped styles because they kind of just threw that one couple videos into your homework in between. But you see there on line 6, it says class name. When you're writing HTML, the attribute is class, right? The important thing is that we're writing in JavaScript now, not HTML. And so like I was talking about before, like class is a JavaScript namespace. And so like if I just come up here and I start saying like class something, like you see it's green and then that class is blue and it's trying to like do stuff for me because like it knows that like class is another thing in JavaScript. And so like React basically renamed that attribute to class name. so that you're not colliding. So this is like, if you want to add a class to an element, you use the class name prop, not the class attribute, right? So this works exactly the same. So that's just, if you need to wondering why a class name shows up, not class, then that's why. Once it compiles, like if I come over here, elements, div, it just says class app, like it compiles down to something that HTML and CSS already understand, but it just, for React inside of a JavaScript file, it can't use the same namespace. So that's that. The other thing is that in HTML, if you say style, you do something like this, and you say color is blah, 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 and it'd be a big long string, and you're basically just writing stuff in here, right? Not the same for React. You need to pass this an object. And so if I were to start typing in here, like I have curly's is an object, right? If I wanted to say like color is white, oops. Why does this not work? Giving me a unexpected token curly brace.
JavaScript and not CSS or.
So you got to think about like, what is, like if I'm writing JSX, what does the curly brace do?
That's just actually going to the JavaScript.
To start writing JavaScript, right? And so this thinks that I'm writing JavaScript now. And so like it says like, hey, I'm trying to access this variable called color. And then all of a sudden you threw in a thing here and then another variable. It's like, that's not even real stuff, right? And so if inside of JavaScript, if I want to define an object, I need a second curly brace. And it's like I'm escaping the JSX and then I'm defining the object, right? So you need two curlies if you want to define an object inside of your JSX. And then Y obviously is trying to act like a variable, so I need to make it a string. Which I made a white, so you can't see it now, but if I could make it blue, now it's blue. Okay. Does that make sense? And so anytime you want to style this, you're not going to be using semicolons because it's an object, you'll be using commas. And so if you wanted to add more styles, you could say like background, back, I can type, I promise. Color is ugly colors. Nice. Okay, so that's the background color. Sweet. I'm not in love with leaving that, but it's okay. Okay, so we're gonna talk about the other hook, probably the most important hook that exists, and also the most complicated thing that exists in React. And it's kind of the linchpin on why some people hate React. Also why I love React. Okay, so inside of source, I'm gonna make a new component. I'm gonna call this one like window sizer.jsx. Okay, so I'm just gonna do the regular stuff. I'm gonna define this children. I don't need you. And then I'm gonna return, just for now, I'm just gonna return, you can even just do this, you know, for simplicity. And then I'm just gonna say window sizer, oops. I suck today, cheese. And then I'm gonna export this function. Okay, I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna import the window sizer that I defined. And I've got a window sizer. Okay. So what if I want my component to re-render times where I'm not updating the state? I want to handle what we call side effects, is like I do something and then something else over here happens, right? That's like a side effect. And so if I wanted to like use that effect, then there's a hook called use effect, right? And use effect is different, where it doesn't return anything at all. It's not like use state, there's no return value. It take an entire callback function though. I do need to import it also if I want to use it. So that is getting named imported from React. And so inside of use effect, I want to do something whenever some effect runs. So anytime there's an effect, anytime my component re-renders, right now, I'm gonna call this function. And so if I want to say, like just console.log here. Okay, and so then I'm gonna make sure I don't have any console logs on counter, so we're not running out everywhere. Boom, boom, no console logs, okay. So I'm inside of here, refresh, so I can get rid of all that stuff. So I'm calling here from inside my thing. And so you'll see like this ran one time, right? Like whenever this component was rendered the first time, it ran this. Now, the only way we currently know how to like re-render the component is by calling a use state, right? So if I say this, then I'm going to say like, sure, it's going to help me do what I was trying to do here. I should probably turn this off. I mean, I said window sizer and it already knows that what I'm trying to do, but so it gave me a use state, and then it called this window object that we just have access to writing browser code. And then it says the inner width value. And so I'm gonna just get that out of here. And I'm gonna say, give me the window dot inner width so we can see what that looks like. And so I refresh, it's 168, right? If I move this, it's still 168 and the component never rendered. But then if I refresh, now it's 226 because it re-rendered again, pulled that value again, right? So I come back over here and I'm going to initialize this use state with that value. And so whenever the component loads, it's going to just pull that value, the inner width, and then it's going to set it to this width. And then it gives me access to the set width method function. Okay, so if I'm in here and I say set width to window dot inner width, go to use effects, we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, and then we can just go ahead and do the same thing we did over there and just call this a return the width there. And we can do window width is this, and we'll say counter is this. Okay. So right now, I've got a state value that will re-render the page anytime set width is called, anytime the width changes. And I've got a use effect that is going to set the width to the window.inner width every time something re-renders the component, right? So if I come over here, oh, I'm not console logging anymore. So we can see it when it gets run. So it's still the same, right? It's not actually doing anything because set width is never getting called yet. And so it's not, or it's getting called, but after that, nothing changes. And so if I wanted to do something extra here to where anytime I press a button or something, or anytime the window width changed, I wanted to do something like, what would I need to do here? This is like something back from HTML that we learned. Whenever I basically want to see whenever the window emits an event, then I want to do something with that. And so what do I need? Anybody know? So if I want to latch onto that event, I need a event listener. Document add event listener. And so the type of the event is I don't know, window resize event is resize. Okay, so the name of this is resize, and I'm going to give it a function to call anytime it resizes. And so I can just say set width here, and I'm going to call window.inner width, Oops, sure. Get rid of this one. We can get rid of this for now, because we're gonna see it change in the browser. Okay, so now we've added an event listener to the use effect itself. And so what that says is whenever this component loads for the first time, we're going to add an event listener that is going to, so like if we re-rendered this component 10 times, use effect would get called 10 times, and we would add 10 event listeners, which we don't need more than one event listener, right? We're just like adding a bunch of nonsense to the browser. And so there's another thing that use effect has that is what's called the cleanup method. And so what you can do inside of use effect is return another function. And that is like, that's what gets called whenever the use effect, I think it gets called before the use effect renders every time. Like before it runs this component, and like whatever you return, it runs that, and then it runs the body of your thing. And then also if this component gets unmounted, which we haven't learned about that, but like if you refresh the page, it'll call this or anything like that. Anytime this component would not be rendered anymore, then it will call this method. And so we can say, what is it? Remove event listener, yeah. And we just say resize. Save that. Okay, so now every time this runs, we're not going to keep adding event listeners. If it runs again, it'll remove the old one and add a new one. So we'll always just have one. But if I come back to my browser and get rid of this thing, we got an error. Remove event listener requires to, I don't remember how this works. Remove event listener. Gotcha. Okay. So add event listener. You can save the value, like the reference to that event listener inside of a variable. So if I say const resize listener equals whatever comes out of that. And then I want to take this and then pass it down here. And so then anytime remove event listener gets called, it's going to take the one from above and then it's going to remove it. Okay. We're here. Our errors are gone. So it's 153. What am I missing? Let's see. We're just going to call this update width. Make it a function. And then we're going to, oh, this needs a function itself. Gotcha. Okay, so the add event listener, it takes a callback function, and I just gave it a function execution, right? Like I called set width, and then I like literally put parentheses on it and called it right away. And so it just, which set width doesn't really return anything. And so then I just basically passed add event listener undefined. And it just didn't have any issues with that, so it never errored. But I need this in front of it, so it knows that this is the function I'm going to call whenever that changes, right? And it's pretty standard to like put the method that or the function that gets called from here instead of another function, but we can do it later. All right, we're still missing something. Okay, so now I am going to make functions that I can log inside of it and see when it gets called. So I am going to call this update width. I'm going to put all this junk. How much? This much? Yeah. I'm just going to put this here. Wrap this in curlies. Make it not hate me. What am I missing? You get in there, you go down there, you go down there. Oh, and then this needs not to be nothing. Update width, right? And then in here, we're going to say console. We just go ahead and put this in a variable. Const inner width equals, you can even destruct this if you wanted to. Right. And then we're gonna console.log that value. And then we're gonna set width to that value. Make sure I'm hitting the right event. I think it is. This is kind of tiny, but. Go back to the V size event. Let's look up the cheat code, React, add. Use effect event. Resize event listener. I don't know what false is, but I guess I'll throw that in there. Let's see. They're defining their function inside of this. I don't know if that shouldn't matter, but we'll see. So it's got a handle resize that sets state, adds event listener. Oh. I'm not sure what that's about. Okay, so this said, instead of setting this value to this, it set it to update with. Which I don't know about that, but we'll see. Yeah, I don't know what that would do. Let's give it the old paste it over my shit.
I mean, I think.
Get rid of the
There's on the next one.
Yeah,
Wait.
right.
with
So I didn't know that.
set with.
I don't know.
It probably, it helps sometimes. Sometimes it like.
Should have left Copilot on. That's what I've been reduced to now. I've been using it. I got nothing left.
Were you using Java vanilla term instead of React? Is that one that I can do? Sometimes just change in what set is. Things you told mine, like it's different from vanilla.
Oh, well, a lot of this stuff doesn't exist in vanilla JavaScript. Yeah. Oh, listen, what's it talking about? Found object with keys height. Oh, this is silly. This should be width. It needs to be inner.
Yeah.
Good.
Then go, you know,
Include the rest of it.
open it if you want.
Counters on the- That's it. See, that's okay.
There we go.
You know, just chat.
All right, so what's different? Only thing I see different is that they don't have a remove event listener, which is fine. The important part is that it has this new thing inside of use effect, which is like the third thing. I'm trying to teach you guys stuff that like I never used, like practically never do I return a cleanup method, or do I need to inside of a use effect? And so it's there, and you're gonna have to research it when you need it, but it's just not that important. This other thing down here is important though. So this is what's called the dependency array. This is the second optional argument to use effect. And so this basically defines, I want to run this function anytime these values change. And so like if I say width is right here, then I could like say, I want width. Anytime that the width value changes between re-renders, it's going to compare the value, what it was and what it is now. And then it's going to say if they're different, then execute this function, and it'll add an event listener, which is not really what we want in this case. And so if you want to, if I did this, what would happen every time this component re-rendered? It would execute it like every time, right? And so then if I had this, it says anytime this value in this array updates, rerun this function, but there's no value in the array. And so this effectively means never rerun this function when we re-render. But the function does run on the first render. And so this is like, you see this often. And it's like, if I want to fetch to an API, like pull weather or something, I don't want to fetch to weather a bunch of times. I just need it just when the page loads. And so you can put that inside your use effect and then give it an empty array, and it'll say, okay, just fetch it when this page loads, right? So that's pretty common there. And we can look at the other set of I want to run this every time, right? And so you can have multiple use effects, right? So if I can define another one, and they can do different things and be completely independent of each other. Like this one only runs when it starts, and then I could have this one only run when some value updates. And so like, let me just have a, we're kind of gonna combine them here. So I'm just gonna make another counter just for demonstration here. So just make a new counter, and I'll just go ahead and set it to 0. Oops, set counter. And so inside of this use effect, I want to just set counter to counter +1, right? What would this do?
It's called. It would just increase counter.
Right, so when this function calls, it increases counter. Then what happens though? Like we've changed the state value, and so then it re-renders the component because that value changed. And then, like you notice, I don't have any dependency array or anything. And so then what would happen on the next re-render? It calls again, and then it updates the counter, which then re-renders the component. And so now we've created an infinite loop, right? Like if I save this and come over here, well, you see this is erroring forever just because we're not doing anything with the counter. But if I just say, I'll probably need to kill this, honestly, just for show you guys how you can just blow up a project. Okay, and then here I can just say, I'll just throw in a thing here. Another div, sucker for some divs. Yeah, what's up? Control Z.
Not copy, but it.
Another counter. Okay, so I'm gonna start it again and try to get it to loop, so now we can see that it is increasing forever. The heck is this? I don't know. So that's how fast it re-renders. It's very quick, right?
Wow.
So now this will basically go forever. So I'm just gonna close it. Cool. So that's that. Don't do that. And so if I wanted this to not loop forever, like what would I need to do to this array, right? Or I need to add the array. So now it would literally just when the page loads, it would just set counter +1 and then it would be done. It would never run again. Or if I in here I said give me counter, then now what happens? So I made the loop again, right? Because the counter updates. So like this is the same. So you never want to have a set state in the same use effect that you're depending on that variable, right? Because then that's a loop. You can even like make like a weird nested loop where you have like, whenever this variable changes, I'm gonna set state to this other variable, and then whenever that variable changes, and you can like make a circle and still loop in a circle. And so you gotta be careful that like you're gonna get a bunch of re-renders if you're depending on too many things. Most of the time, you're not gonna need to depend on like most use cases are just this, like whenever the page runs, go hit that API or whatever, right? And that's kind of the general use cases. I should probably delete this so I don't. And oops. Yeah. Go away. Oh, we've never looked at this. If you want, like this is giving me a warning because it says it's undefined. If you put a. All right. Okay. So if I get rid of this one, now that one's undefined. Yeah, I guess so. It doesn't like that. Normally, if I want to define something and not use it, like let's say I'm getting an argument here, but I don't want it. I just want to use the second thing that comes through, then you can like not use it. Oh, so it works like that. But so now it's like I don't want to use that one, and you could even just give it just that. That way you can like have access to the second one that's like, count or whatever.
That's super useful.
I guess you can't do it on state values, so forget I said that. Anyways, we can just ignore this for now. Oops, we have another counter, so it doesn't really matter that much. Okay, does anyone have any questions or anything to add about that stuff? Use effects and stuff. It's a lot.
Said there was a linchpin for why people don't like it. Is it this extra bracket at the end?
Yeah. Yeah, so when I started learning like 4 or 5 years ago, this was just coming out. And so before that, you had to write the classes, and they basically had what they call life cycle methods. And we can look at that because I think it's important to know. React life cycle methods. And it means like the life cycle of a component. And so everything that it goes through from like being mounted, rendered, and then updated, and then unmounted, and then, that kind of stuff. Blah, blah, blah. We can get the good ones. So like here, they all look like this, and we've never looked at functions, but like this is like a method that you put on the function that React understands. So it has to be this exact name of the method. But it says like whenever the component mounts, run this thing, right? And so that's kind of like use effect. Like if I give it a dependency, right? Like right when that component first loads, it's going to execute that function. And so this kind of does the same thing, but it only does it when it mounts, right? And then there's another one that's like, there's like weird verbiage, like one's like a should and one's like a did, and it's like one happens before it updates and one happens when it did update. But there's like render get snapshot. Give me the normal ones, component did update. And so like this is like, okay, now counter updated, and now I want to call this, right? And so it's like they're very specific. And it's like when I'll have 5 of them on every component. That's like when it loads, do this, when it updates, do this, like, and it's separated. And some people like that it's like it's very explicit in what it's going to do, and you're never going to have something weird happen. You're never going to like, oops, I made an infinite loop and stuff, right? But it's kind of robust. And so like use effect is just, here's this thing, run this function, and you figure out how often it should, execute it. And so some people, it's kind of like some people don't like JavaScript because it's the Wild West and you can just shove anything into any variable like all the time, and you can just return anything you want. And so some people like the rigidity, and some people like that you can just do whatever. And so this is the rigidity, and modern React is the do whatever. So if you see weird shit like that, that's what it is, and don't use it because it sucks.
The rigidity afterwards, the JavaScript, when people are used to it, and kind of just, throw stuff at it, it works.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So let me see what else I had today. Where am I? Day 2, kill that readme. Oh, we should do this one too. It didn't do that. This will be fun just because it gives you a new tool. Where are we at? Day 2, yeah. Let's do the input first. Okay, so I'm going to define a new component that I can use everywhere, and it's just going to be like a regular input. And so this is like a way that I can make like the most reusable a component can be, right? And an input is kind of like the base input, and also something that you expect to have state and be able to update it, right? So I'm just going to define a new component. I'm just going to call it just input like this, and you'll see like whenever we're using it, the difference will be that my input is with a capital I and the HTML input is with lowercase I. Input equals this. Return and oops, input. Don't need that. And then let's export it and import it. Export default input. Here. I don't know if you guys hate working this abstractly and not like building anything, but we'll like start building stuff eventually. But it's hard to like, let's go out and build this thing when we only know like half of it,
Question real quick.
Yeah.
Is there a reason you're using TSX there, not JSX?
Oh shit, that's the problem.
I was wondering, because I was definitely like, this is TypeScript.
Yeah, that's why it gave me that error, because it like didn't know what I was talking about. So use TSX. Your compiler needs to know that you're going to use TSX to know how to handle it, which is it's the file extension for TypeScript React components, which is what I use at work. So it's like I have it. Okay, so I have an input, right? What does an input take? What's its base stuff? Value, yeah. And then that needs something, and then we need what's the event that it has? Anybody remember that? It's been a while since we did HTML, huh? Everything has an on as a hint, so it's on something, right? Like button was on click, and input does what? On change, yeah. Okay, and so then these will both have things. You can kind of see that they line up directly with like a set state. There's one side and the other side, right? Value is the first one and on change is the second one. So we can say like this, and then we can just say like input value set input value equals use state. And then what should the default value of use state be?
Empty string.
String, yeah, and why?
That's what you want to start with.
Right, that's true. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop these in here. And then set input. Set input value. Okay, and so set input value is expecting the new string value, right? So I need to do this. And then this is, we've done this before, I think, but so an on change element, like the function that it calls gives you an event, right? And then you can say event, and then that has a property on it called target. And then that has a property on it called value. And so we're going to take this event.target.value and we're going to put it into here. Oops, I can't do that all in the parameter, silly. Event target.value like that. So I'm going to take the event and then I'm going to take the event.target.value and put that into the input value state variable. So what this means is like the event is like the entire event that's emitted, right? The target is like what the target of that event is literally in the DOM, which is the whole entire input element. And so if you just logged out on change event.target, you would get a HTML element in the console, right? And so then the value of that HTML element after you update it is, so like if I type in an input and I say H, right? The input itself has already changed. The value of the input is now H, right? Then it emits an event that says, okay, I've updated. Like that's regular HTML stuff, right? It says I've updated with this, and now the value of that input element is the string of H. And so then we're going to take that value and set it to our own state value, right? And then now that we set it to value, input value has now updated to be H. And then it re-renders this component and it's telling it, hey, I want the value of this input to be that. And so it starts out as empty string. I say H, the input changes, becomes H, that re-renders, and the new value is H, right? And so that's like the cycle of every time you type a character, it updates the state, re-renders, and that's the new state that's passed in. And so this is called like a controlled input, meaning that I want to tell it what its own value is, and I want to handle every update. And then the uncontrolled input would just be if I had none of this stuff, and I just said, like an input by itself can handle its own state internally, because like when you press H, it knows. And so that would be like handling itself, right? And so like we are now manually changing this. And so if I get my server back up, kill this thing. There's just one. So we got an input, and then we can say here, console.log this input value, right? And so now every time that this thing changes, so you can see the input is already empty string here, right? And so if I type H, or no, that's an F, but you know, whatever, H. So every time I update, the component is re-rendering. And so anytime, like if I had something really expensive right here, that was like an API call or something, it would be re-rendering. Like if I just literally said fetch right here, every time I hit a character, it would fetch again, right? And so that's what useEffect does also, is it not only lets you do stuff when things re-render, it also stops things. Like if you put a fetch inside of a useEffect, then with the square brackets, then now every time I press H, it's not going to re-render, because it only re-renders when the page first loads, not on re-renders, right? I guess I could use the word mount as the correct terminology, right? So when it first mounts, it calls useEffect and it would make the fetch. And then every time I start typing in the input, it's not going to do anything. And so if I can, the example is, this is effectively some function call. And then if I put this inside a useEffect here, I mean, this could be anything. It could be making a request to the weather API, it could be whatever. If I put it in here, and I need to import it, obviously. So now this will do exactly the same thing. Refresh. Because every time this updates, use effect runs again and logs again. If I add this, now it never does it. Right? I'm not getting any more console logs. That function's not being executed anymore. So it also helps limit the side effects. I don't want these things to run every time, just when I want, right? This is a common thing that you just kind of have to live with for now. As like a safety thing, it wants you to only put things inside of use effects that are necessary to be inside of a use effect, but a lot of times you don't want that. Like you want to write it how you want, and that's why it's a warning and not an error. But sometimes you'll have a lot of these warnings, so you can just kind of ignore it. But it says like, I'm accessing input value, and it says like, hey, it has a missing dependency in this array, like input value. Either include it in the array, or include it in the array, or remove the dependency array. And so it doesn't like that I'm accessing input value, but that's like, okay, if that's what you want to do, and like that's what like you're setting out to do, like it's fine. Like if I want to say, this would be good to show. Let's go to a new component and we can talk about that one. 1127. I'm doing a battery. Doing fine. We can just call this the all weather JSX const weather equals this, and then export it. We can do a named export just so we can get familiar with that too. So come in here, if I want to use weather, what do I need here, right? I need these curlies. Then I can render it like normal. Oops. Okay, so inside of here, I want to basically do what we were doing before. I want to fetch the weather, and then I want to render something to the page after the weather is fetched, right? And so step one is fetching the weather. And so we can use the fetch that we've seen. It's been a minute since I wrote this. I'm probably just going to go copy it from the old one. When did we do that? 2? Does anyone remember? Weather stuff? Module 3. Do the old fetch. We can do this instead. Instead of weather, we'll do posts. So I'm just going to take all of this stuff. I'm going to rename this component to posts. I'm going to paste this in here. Save that, come here. So this is still weather JSX. Rename this to posts. Sorry, guys. You can see it renamed for you because VS Code's awesome. Still a named export. So like if I was using a default export and I renamed all that stuff to posts and I still had this as weather, it would still work, and then it would be misleading, right? So that's kind of why it's nice to have named exports sometimes. So I'm using post the file, and we're here. Okay, so this will work, right? Like it's still just a JavaScript function that gets run, even if it doesn't return any JSX. I'm pretty sure it should still, yeah, see. So that function still executes. You can run functions like that. I mean, why would you though? But so fetch.then we have 100 entries. So let's rewrite this to be more responsive. So if I want to come down here, I want to return. Let's look at our data real quick. See what we're working with. Like, what's the shape of these posts? What are you doing here? Oh, this is not inside of curlies. It needs its body. And then someone's still angry. It says a comment. Okay. So here's all my posts. One of them looks like a ID, title, user ID, and body. Okay, so we can just make a note of that real quick. ID, title, user ID. Body like that, right? User ID. Yeah. Okay, so this is what our data looks like. I want to put this in, I want to do this when the page loads. So I need a use effect, right? Just to make sure that it's not running a whole bunch of times. Use effect. Put this in here, need to import that. Okay, and then I can give it that dependency array. So now it's going to only run this once right when it loads. So we refresh this. There's, I think I want to take a break from this real quick. The other time a component re-renders, there's a few times, but the other time that is actually something we've seen is that anytime the props change, right? So like if posts, I could even do this. I don't know how much I want to make these components ugly. Here's what we can do. So I've got an input. Oh, I didn't even make this reusable. Okay, so input, right? The idea of it being reusable is that I can call this from anywhere. And so if this input is maintaining its own value, then how would something trying to use it know what the input value is, right? That's what we call like lifting state up. And so if I wanted to call input on app.js, but I wanted app.js to know what the value of the input was, like right now, this is just happening below app.js. So nothing in app.js even knows, right? And so to fix that, I need to pass props here, not input, value. Like I'm going to define the value above the input. I'm going to pass that down into the input, right? And so we can just say like on change and just give it the things that it expects. So it's pretty straightforward. And so I come in here, I'm going to destructure my props and I'm going to say value and on change. And then instead of having the state variable here, we can leave this here. We'll fix it in a second. So open this up, come in here. We need to move this now into here, which you normally wouldn't put stuff like this in your top level app, but so now I've got the input up above, and so I can pass these down now. And I need to import my set state. I come into my input. I no longer need this, and then the value will be set to value. And then on change, we're going to call on change. Okay, there is no more value. And then we can actually just do this, use effect to show this. Use state's no longer used. Come over here. So we should be where we were, right? It's gonna, I think I have like a million logs going on right now. Let's get rid of this one. Let's get rid of these for now. Refresh. Here. So it still works. Like it just the state is above the input and I'm passing it down. And then I'm also passing down the function. So you can pass anything through the props, right? And so here I'm passing down like, hey, I want you to call this on change method whenever something changes. And so we're passing that all the way down to the input. It's calling the on change from above, which then re-renders that component because it changed, which then re-renders the input with the new value, passes the value back down through the props. And so we're getting this logged every time because this entire component is re-rendering because these props have changed. See what I mean? So it's not re-rendering like before it would re-render because the state value would change where it was. Now it's re-rendering because the props itself is changing. It's comparing them every time it re-renders. Okay, so that's that, right? And so now I have this input value here. I want to do the same. I want to say posts. I think that explains the point I was trying to make there. So now we've got this use effect and we're getting these posts. Okay, so I need to do something with this data that we're getting. So I think what we're used to before is to like, this is going to run And then I'm gonna need to update some value after it runs, and so we would have used like a let post equal an array. And then after this runs, we're gonna set posts to that array. But then we've seen like that won't refresh the page or won't re-render this component, right? And so I need to use the set state. And so I can say posts, and I'm gonna store my posts in here. And then I'm gonna do boom, and then I'm gonna say use state, import that. And then the default for this array of posts will be an empty array. Okay, and then we're gonna come down here. So I've got this like whole thing of data. We've got all these entries, and we're gonna say set posts to data. And so everything that comes through that thing is gonna be set inside of there. And save that, save this, over here, refresh. Okay, so we've got 100 entries. I'm gonna close this and this and this and this. Okay, so now if I want to use these posts, I need to return HTML that will show them, right? So I can say return. And in here, I need some sort of HTML. So we can just put in a div for now. And then now what do I need to do? If I want to like take all of this post array that I have in state and I want to render it on the page, what do I need to write? What kind of brackets? Curly braces, yeah. And then what? So I've got an array. So I can just, I've got post, right? So now I'm in the brackets, I'm writing JavaScript. So I have access to this post array. And then I need to do something with the array, which is probably an array method, right? Map through it, yeah. You could do a for each, but it'd break. So I've got a map. Map takes what? Yeah, a callback function. And then we don't really need the curlies here. We just do this. And so now we have access to what inside of this, like what is coming through here. An object, right? Like the whole post object, right? So this is one post. And so inside of here, I could say start returning some JSX again. And so I could say I've got a div and it's got post. And then we've looked at indexes, I think, right? We've got an index. And so you could say post, like the index of this post. It's like post 0 would be the first one, or you'd say like +1. So it'd be like post 1, post 2, post 3, right? But then this also has like an ID. And so we could just like render the ID instead of the index, but we don't necessarily like, it's not going to look that pretty for us because it's going to be probably some big hash or something, but we can use Eugen's ID for now. I don't know exactly what the shape of that is. I guess we could look. Oh, we're not logging anymore. Okay, so I can get this ID. I'm going to destructure from here. And so I'm going to take the ID out and I'm going to say post ID is this. Then I want to say down here, oops. A div, I'm going to say post title is the title. And so I can put all these values. So I have title, user ID, body, right? Which this is just an ID, so it's not going to mean anything because you don't actually know the user's name from this object. We're going to say div, lots of divs, and then we're going to say post body is, oops, body. Okay, so we've got a big squigglies. It says one parent element. What do we need to do for that? You know, need a fragment around these. Okay. Okay, so let's just think about like what happens in the life cycle of this component, right? Whenever the page first loads, like what is the value of posts? Like initially, before anything happens, like what is the value of posts? Empty array, right? And then after, so it just initializes because we're passing in empty array. That's what, remember, this is the initializer. And so it's an empty array. Then the page mounts and it runs this use effect. And so this component has been rendered to the page before this function executes, because it's a asynchronous, or it's a promise, right? And it takes time. So it could be a few seconds. If it's a really slow page, you have terrible internet, it could be like 10 seconds, right? And so here, post is going to be an empty array. So you're going to have just a div with nothing in it when the page first loads. Then it's going, once this effect finally finishes, it's going to finish this thing, it's going to response JSON, take the data, and it's going to set post to that data, right? And so after the data comes through, after the fetch finishes, then we're going to update the posts state value, which then causes a re-render. And then it's going to take all of that new data and it's going to render the new thing that it's mapping through and create the new elements on the page, right? And so like now I've got, we can use our style tags here. Remember JavaScript, then object. We're going to say margin bottom is like 30. Oh, we didn't talk about that. So if I say margin bottom 30, that's a number, it'll accept that. You can use the nut like a string of like 30 px, or you can use a literal number of 30 and it'll just interpret that as 30 pixels. But if I did this, that's not valid anymore, because now it's going to give CSS literally 30, which it doesn't know what value that means. And if I wanted to say like, 3 rem or something in here, you could do that too inside of the string. But if you give it a number, it's just going to by default interpret that as pixels. Did I save this? What's going on here? Oh, because it's long. Let's just zoom out a little bit. Oop, not that one. Okay, so now we've rendered all of our posts. So like if I refresh, it's gonna flash from the refresh. Huh? Oh yeah. I don't know if you guys have seen that before. Where is it here? Settings. Niche work. Throttling. Like this is like if you have terrible internet. So it's like right now it's making the request and then it shows up, right? So like all of that time it's sitting there not displaying anything. And so like what can we do, right? Like we're sitting there waiting for this to load. So what we could say is like we have just like a const loading equals, and you don't have to use use state for everything, right? Just anything that's not a use state will be dependent on everything else to render, right? But if I say loading equals I am loading if the post doesn't have a length, right? So if I say posts dot length, so this is equal to 0, or if I have a bunch of posts, that's equal to 100. So if I don't have that, then that is now false, right? And so yeah, so if I don't have posts, then loading is true. And so then I can come down here and I'm saying loading. I can just say a div. Love me some divs. Loading. Right, so if it's loading, then it's going to return this div that says loading. And then after the post come through, then it's going to return the actual thing. It's like now we've created a loading state. Nice and slow.
Well, it's like,
Okay, so now it's, see, like for a second, it has loading state. So if you were to like, there's a lot of things out there that are already built for you. Like, so you could just find like React loading spinner or things like that. You could just import that component from that package. And so now that you know NPM, you know base React, you know how to import things, like that's the ecosystem now. Like you could literally type React something you're looking for, and I'm sure someone's built it, and you could just download it, like add their package and go npm install that package. A lot of them will tell you instructions on how to use it and set it up. And then you could just find it, use it and drop it in, right? And so we could do that right now. We could say React loading spinner. Like there's always something. There's rarely have I just been like, yeah, there's nothing out there. I'm gonna have to make it myself, right? Yeah, so if I want to use this, it says installation, npm install React loader spinner dash dash save, which you don't actually have to say dash dash save anymore. Pick control C out of this. If I do ls, I'm in the root level because I can see my package JSON, right? And so if I say copy and paste that, npm install React loader spinner, I'm just gonna delete this so you can see that it works. So we're gonna go and install that. Say added 16 packages, whatever its subdependencies were, right? I don't know what all of their, they got this page too. Let's see what this is. So if I want a circles, I want this thing.
Oh, wow.
So I can just take this component, go into here and say, if it's loading, I'm just going to do that. And if I want to use circles, you can see it's importing circles from React loader spinner. So I can save that. And whatever all this other stuff is, I don't know. I don't care right now. We're just going to see what came out right. So refresh something. Oh, I'm not running my server anymore. npm run start. Refresh. Do something. Oh, it's over here.
There it is.
Yeah.
So like you could do that with literally anything. If you wanted to use a table, if you wanted to use anything, like there's even like special hooks that people wrote that's like use resize event listener. That's like everything we just wrote. It just there's the hook that's like use window resize and it'll just give you the state variable back and stuff like that. So like if you're working too hard, there's probably something out there. And so it's probably good to just like get familiar with like the things that are popular, and you can kind of see like the thing that I went to. If its documentation looks like this, it's probably a pretty good sign that they know what they're doing. Let's see, what was their package? You can also look at their npm package and see like it's got 157,000 weekly downloads. So it's like pretty well used thing. You can trust it pretty well. I think that's good for today. I'll post homework later. Any questions about any of that stuff? You want to see the sweet spinner again?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Oh, this one's not throttled, so it's like instant, but
It's a little peak.
sweet. This was literally my first job interview. Where they just gave me a API. They're like, find this, here's a CDN. That means like content delivery network, right? They're like, here's this URL, fetch it and show it on the page. And that was it. I mean, it's really like, if you can do this, you can have the ability to learn anything out there and like read documentation on other packages, like that's kind of it. You just kind of need to like build all the surrounding ecosystem and stuff. And like, make it look better, but
That's good.
like yellow and blue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mine's fine.
Yeah.
Big compliment.
Sweet. All right, guys. Where's my Zoom?
Trash.